The silence in the grand dining room was a weapon. It was heavier than the crystal chandelier that hung above them, more cutting than the sterling silver knives resting beside their plates. Elias Vance felt it press down on him, a physical weight designed to crush. Across the polished mahogany, his wife, Isabel, slid a crisp, cream-colored envelope toward him. Her hand, once so delicate in his, was steady. Her face, a mask of rehearsed sorrow, was framed by the opulent backdrop of her father's mansion. This was not a conversation. It was a coronation, and he was the jester being dethroned. Her brother Julian leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. It was the same smirk he'd worn for the entirety of their 5-year marriage, a constant, grating expression of condescending amusement. Her father, Marcus Thorne, a man who moved through the world as if he owned it, and in many ways he did, observed the scene with the detached satisfaction of a king watching a perfectly executed maneuver on a chessboard. They believed this was the end. They thought they were discarding a piece of used, slightly disappointing furniture. They saw a man who was quiet, unassuming, a moderately successful architect who had somehow stumbled into their gilded world and was now finally being put back in his place. They saw a charity case, a man whose body was still frail from the surgery that had saved his wife's life, a man they had tolerated, patronized, and were now dismissing with a clean, legal stroke. What they didn't see, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was the truth. They didn't know that the very foundation of their world, the Thorne Corporation, the mansion, the illusion of their unassailable power, was a magnificent house of cards, and Elias Vance, the man they were so casually attempting to break, was the one holding the table it was built on. This envelope wasn't an ending. It was a trigger. If you believe that true strength is quiet and that integrity is the ultimate currency, then you'll want to see how this story unfolds. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us that things are not always as they seem. The journey to this moment of quiet, theatrical cruelty had begun not with an argument, but with an act of profound love. It had begun in the sterile, antiseptic chill of a hospital room 2 months prior. The air hummed with the low, rhythmic beeping of monitors, a symphony of survival. Isabel lay in the bed, pale and fragile, a ghost of her usual vibrant self. A new heart, a miracle of medicine and timing, beat steadily within her chest. Beside her bed, in a separate room down the hall, Elias was recovering from his own procedure. He hadn't given her his heart, not literally. He had given her a kidney. His own health had been compromised by a rare, aggressive infection post-surgery, a complication that had nearly cost him everything, while Isabel's own recovery, funded by a mysterious, anonymous benefactor, was progressing smoothly. He remembered the moment he'd woken up, a dull, persistent ache in his side and a fog in his mind. His first question, whispered through dry, cracked lips, was, "Is she okay?" The nurse had smiled, a kind, weary expression. "She's doing wonderfully. You're a hero, Mr. Vance." But in the eyes of the Thorne family, he was no hero. He was a necessary, if inconvenient, part of the equation. Marcus and Julian had visited him once in his room. They stood awkwardly by the door, clad in bespoke suits that seemed to repel the hospital's scent of disinfectant and despair. "Well, Elias," Marcus had begun, his voice a low rumble that brooked no argument, "you've done a noble thing." The word noble was delivered as if it were a foreign object in his mouth, something he found distasteful. Julian had simply glanced around the drab room, his gaze lingering on the standard-issue plastic water pitcher. "Isabel is getting the best care, of course. We've seen to it. The suite on the penthouse floor is much more comfortable." The implication hung in the air. thick and suffocating. Isabel was in luxury, while he was here, in the common ward. The hero was in steerage while the princess recovered in the royal suite. Elias had only nodded, too weak to engage in their games. "I'm just glad she's going to be all right," he had managed. "Yes. Well," Marcus had cleared his throat, a gesture of dismissal. "The important thing is her recovery. The doctors say the anonymous donation for her heart transplant was a godsend, covered everything, a top-tier procedure. We wouldn't have settled for less." He clapped Elias lightly on the shoulder, a gesture devoid of warmth. "You rest up. Isabel will need support when she comes home." They left as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the lingering chill of their condescension. Elias had closed his eyes, listening to the steady drip of his IV. He had given a piece of himself, physically and irrevocably, to the woman he loved. He had endured complications that left him weakened and vulnerable, and her family, in their moment of gratitude, had found a way to remind him of his station. They didn't know who the anonymous benefactor was. They didn't know the donation had been arranged and funded not by some distant philanthropist, but by Elias himself, through a series of shell corporations and blind trusts so complex it would have made Marcus Thorne's head spin. He had paid for her new heart. He had paid for her penthouse suite. He had paid for the world-renowned surgeon, and then he had given her his kidney for good measure. He had done it all quietly, secretly, because his love wasn't a transaction. It wasn't something to be flaunted or used as leverage. He believed it was a gift, freely given. He was about to learn, in the harshest way imaginable, that in the world of the Thornes, every gift has a price tag, and every act of kindness is merely an opening negotiation. The ache in his side was nothing compared to the slow, dawning ache of that realization. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in humiliation, delivered with the casual cruelty that only the truly arrogant can muster. Elias was discharged from the hospital a week after the Thornes' perfunctory visit, still walking with a stiffness that betrayed the deep, pulling ache in his abdomen. He returned not to a hero's welcome, but to an atmosphere of polite, suffocating pity. The Grand Thorne mansion, which had been his and Isabel's home since their wedding, suddenly felt alien. It was her family's territory, and he was merely a guest whose welcome had long since expired. Isabel, buoyed by her new heart and the constant fawning attention of her family, was regaining her strength with remarkable speed. Her color returned, her laughter once again filled the cavernous halls, laughter that rarely seemed to include him. When he entered a room, conversations would often fall to a hush, or worse, continue as if he weren't there at all. He was a ghost at their feast, a living reminder of a debt they had no intention of ever acknowledging, let alone repaying. His own recovery was slow, hampered by the lingering effects of the post-surgical infection. He was forced to scale back his work, taking only minor consultations he could handle from his small home office, a room the Thornes referred to as Elias's little hobby space. Julian was particularly relentless. He'd saunter into the office, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, and peer over Elias's shoulder at the blueprints spread across his desk. "Still tinkering with your little drawings, Eli?" he'd sneer, using the diminutive nickname Elias despised. "Must be nice to have so much free time. While you're playing with lines on paper, real men are closing deals, building empires." Elias would simply continue his work, his hand steady as he drew a perfectly straight line. "It's how empires begin, Julian, with a line on paper." "Cute," Julian would laugh, a harsh, barking sound. "Listen, Dad and I were talking. It can't be easy for you, what with your situation." He gestured vaguely at Elias's torso. "And your business not exactly booming. We don't want Isabel to worry about finances while she's recovering. So, Dad's decided to help you out." He'd pull a check from his jacket pocket and place it on the desk, deliberately covering a crucial section of the blueprint. A little stipend. For your troubles. The first time it happened, Elias had stared at the check. It was for $1,000, a pittance to the Thorns, but an amount delivered with the weight of a royal decree. It wasn't a gift. It was a leash. It was a weekly reminder that they saw him as a dependent, a kept man. He never cashed them. He simply placed them in a drawer, a growing collection of paper insults. The physical humiliation was paired with a deeper emotional erosion. Marcus would hold court at the dinner table, pontificating about the market, about power, about the weakness of his competitors. He'd often direct his pronouncements at Elias, framed as benevolent advice. You see, Elias, the world is divided into predators and prey, he'd say, carving a slice of roast beef with surgical precision. You have to be willing to do what it takes to stay on top. Sentiment, loyalty, these are luxuries for the common man. In our world, they are liabilities. He would look at Elias, his eyes cold and assessing. A man's worth is measured by what he provides. A lesson you'd do well to learn. Through it all, Isabel remained silent. She was the silent enabler, the linchpin of his pain. When her brother mocked him, she would study her manicure. When her father belittled him, she would ask for the salt to be passed. She offered him no defense, no words of support. Her gratitude for his sacrifice had evaporated, replaced by an allegiance to the glittering, hollow world of her family. She was choosing their strength over his perceived weakness. But in the quiet of his hobby space, long after the house had fallen silent, Elias was not weak. He was not idle. He would lock the door, the click of the tumbler a small, satisfying sound of defiance. He would sit at his desk, not in front of his architectural drawings, but in front of a secure, encrypted laptop. He'd put on a pair of noise-canceling headphones, and the world of the Thorns would disappear. A different world would emerge. A world of stock tickers, international wire transfers, and confidential acquisition reports. He would make a call, his voice low and authoritative, completely different from the quiet, measured tones he used with the family. "Chen, it's Vance," he'd say. On the other end of the line, in a skyscraper overlooking Hong Kong Harbor, one of the world's most powerful and reclusive financiers would sit up a little straighter. "Mr. Vance, always a pleasure. How is your sabbatical?" "It's proving educational," Elias would reply, a dry, humorless smile touching his lips. "Report on the Thorn Corporation restructuring." "Phase 1 complete, sir. We've finished the silent acquisition of all outstanding majority shares through the Ethelred subsidiary. As of last Tuesday, you own 98.6% of the company. The remaining 1.4% is scattered among legacy minority shareholders. Marcus Thorn believes he still holds a controlling 51% stake through his family trust." Elias would look at the wall, at the faint outline of a water stain the Thorns had never bothered to fix. And he's not aware that the trust's assets were leveraged against loans that were then purchased by us, sir. 3 months ago, he's functionally bankrupt and doesn't know it. He's a king ruling a kingdom of sand. "Good," Elias would say. He would then reach into the drawer, past the uncashed checks from Marcus, and pull out a simple, worn leather portfolio. It was locked with a small, unassuming brass key that he wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. It never left him. Inside that portfolio was not just data or financial reports. It contained the original deeds, the hard copy share certificates, the ultimate, irrefutable proof of ownership. It was his hidden power, his patient, meticulously prepared response to a war he hadn't started, but which he was now grimly determined to finish. He was being tested, and he would not be found wanting. The escalation was a slow, deliberate strangulation of his dignity. The thorns, emboldened by his quiet passivity, grew more brazen. They began to openly plan Isabel's future, as if he were already a footnote in a chapter they were eager to close. The pretense of including him in their lives was dropped, replaced by an overt campaign to erase him. It began with casual conversations he was meant to overhear. "Darling, once you're fully recovered, we must get you back to the slopes," Marcus would boom, standing by the large bay window that overlooked the manicured lawns. "Gstaad, perhaps. Remember that little chalet we loved? Your husband doesn't ski, does he? No matter. It will be a good chance for you to clear your head." Julian would chime in, his tone dripping with false concern. "And we need to get you back on the charity circuit. The fundraiser for the art museum is coming up. It's so important for you to be seen. You can't be cooped up in this house forever with, well, you know." The unspoken words, with him, the invalid, the bore, hung in the air like poison. Isabel, caught in the gravitational pull of their ambition, began to adopt their language. "Elias, I think I need some space," she told him one afternoon. She didn't look at him, focusing instead on arranging a bouquet of lilies, their funereal scent filling the room. "Just for a little while. To focus on my health. Daddy thinks it would be best if you found your own place for a bit. Nothing permanent, of course. Just until I'm stronger." He looked at her, truly looked at her, searching for the woman who had wept with joy when he'd proposed, the woman who had held his hand and sworn to stand by him in sickness and in health. He saw a stranger. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, were now cool and distant, reflecting the polished gleam of her family's wealth. "My own place," he repeated softly. "This is our home, Isabel?" "It's Daddy's house," she corrected him gently, as if speaking to a child. "He's been so generous to let us stay here. But it's time we stood on our own 2 feet. Or at least it's time I did. You need to focus on getting your practice back up and running, don't you?" It was a perfectly crafted dismissal, wrapped in the guise of concern for his well-being. He was being evicted from his own life, and she was framing it as an act of kindness. He simply nodded. "If that's what you think is best." His acquiescence was mistaken for weakness. To them, it was confirmation that he was a man with no resources, no fight, no backbone. They had won. But that night, Elias did not pack a bag. He did not look at apartment listings. Instead, he drove his modest sedan, another object of the Thorns' ridicule, the teacher's car, Julian called it, to a sleek glass and steel tower in the heart of the city's financial district. He took the private elevator to the penthouse floor, to the offices of Albright and Sterling, a law firm so fearsome and so expensive that its name was only ever whispered by the city's elite. He was not there to see a divorce lawyer. Divorce was a skirmish. Elias was preparing for total war. He was shown immediately into the office of Ms. Evelyn Albright. She was a woman who seemed to be carved from granite and ice, with a mind that moved like a predator. She stood when he entered, a rare sign of respect. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion, "everything is in place." "Evelyn," he greeted her, taking the seat opposite her vast empty desk. The only object on its surface was a single, slim file. "The final pieces of the puzzle arrived from the Cayman office this morning," she said, tapping the file. "The paper trail is a work of art, untraceable to you, until you want it to be. The leverage points are secure. The Thorn Family Trust is a hollow shell. Marcus Thorn is, for all intents and purposes, an employee of Ethelred Holdings, living in a house owned by Ethelred Holdings and spending money from a credit line extended by Ethelred Holdings." Elias felt a grim sense of finality settle over him. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about justice, It was about the cold, hard reality of consequences. And the personal assets? Julian's sports car is leased through one of our subsidiary companies. The lease can be terminated for breach of contract at any time. The Gstad Chalet is also an Ethelred property, held for executive use. Marcus doesn't own it. He has access privileges which can be revoked. She paused, her gaze sharp. They have nothing that we don't control. The only question, Elias, is when you want to pull the plug. Elias thought for a long moment. He thought of the uncashed checks in his drawer. He thought of Julian's sneer, Marcus's lectures, and Isabel's averted eyes. He thought of the ache in his side, a constant reminder of a gift that had been thrown back in his face. "They're planning a family dinner next Friday," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "to celebrate Isabel's new beginning. They've invited me. I believe they intend for it to be my formal dismissal." A rare, thin smile touched Evelyn Albright's lips. How wonderfully theatrical of them. "Isn't it?" Elias agreed. He reached into his coat and pulled out the small brass key from the chain around his neck. He placed it on the desk. "This opens a safe deposit box at First National downtown. It contains the hard copies, the portfolio." Evelyn picked up the key, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a rare jewel. "And you want me to bring the contents to the dinner?" "No," Elias said, standing up. "I want you and Mr. Chen to be waiting outside. At 9 o'clock sharp, they are going to hand me what they believe is the end of a story. I want to be the one to hand them the beginning of theirs." The night of the final dinner arrived, cloaked in an atmosphere of suffocating politeness. The air in the Thorne mansion was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume, a fragrant veneer over the metallic tang of impending victory. For the Thornes, this was a coronation and a severance, all in one. They were celebrating Isabel's glorious return to her rightful place among the elite, and they were, with what they considered admirable grace, cutting the final thread that tied her to her unfortunate middle-class past. Her husband. Elias arrived precisely at 7. He wore a simple, well-tailored but unremarkable navy suit. It was a uniform of quiet competence, but in the opulent halls of the Thorne mansion, against Julian's flashy, brand-name Italian silk and Marcus's stately, custom-made pinstripes, it looked to them like a symbol of his mediocrity. "Eli, you made it." Julian greeted him at the door, a glass of champagne already in his hand. He looked Elias up and down, a flicker of a smirk touching his lips. "Brave choice with the suit. Very dependable." "It's a suit, Julian," Elias replied, his voice calm. "It's not meant to be a personality." Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, clapping Elias on the back with forced bonhomie. "Always the philosopher. Come in, have a drink. Try to enjoy yourself. It's a big night for Izzy." The dining room was aglow, the table laden with the family's best china and silver. Marcus stood at the head of the table, a patriarch surveying his domain. He nodded curtly at Elias. "Elias, good of you to come." Isabel was the radiant center of it all. She wore a shimmering, backless dress that showcased her renewed vitality. She glowed with health and privilege. When she saw Elias, she offered him a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The guilt and resolve warred on her face, but resolve was clearly winning. They sat down to dinner, and the performance began. The conversation was a carefully orchestrated tapestry of topics from which Elias was implicitly excluded. They talked of a planned family trip to the Amalfi Coast. "We'll have to get the yacht serviced," Marcus noted, of Julian's latest genius investment idea, of the guest list for the upcoming winter gala. Elias was an island in their sea of chatter, a silent observer at his own execution. The main course was cleared, and Marcus tapped his glass with a fork. the crystal ringing out in the suddenly quiet room. "A toast," he announced, his voice resonating with authority. He beamed at his daughter. "To Isabel, to her health, her strength, and to the bright shining future that awaits her. A future of new beginnings, free from the burdens of the past." His eyes flicked to Elias for a brief, pointed moment. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Julian and Isabel echoed. Elias simply raised his water glass in a silent, ambiguous gesture. After the toast, Marcus cleared his throat, adopting the tone of a benevolent but firm executive addressing a redundant employee. "Elias," he began, "we as a family have been talking, and we feel it's time for some clarity. Your contribution to Isabel's health was significant, and for that, we are grateful." He said the word grateful as if it were a business expense he was reluctantly approving. "However," he continued, "it's clear that you and Isabel are on different paths now. Her world is one of responsibility, of influence. Your world is different. We feel it's in everyone's best interest to make a clean break." He reached into his jacket and produced a thick envelope, placing it on the table beside Elias's plate. "This is a severance," Marcus said, the ultimate insult delivered with the gravitas of a king. "A generous one. Enough for you to get a new place, get your business back on its feet, and start over. In exchange, we expect a quiet, uncontested divorce. No fuss, no mess. You disappear quietly, and we all move on." Julian leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Think of it as a golden parachute, Eli. You flew coach into our lives, but we're letting you parachute out in first class." Isabel finally looked at him, her expression pleading. "It's for the best, Elias. You have to see that. We want different things." Elias looked at the envelope from Marcus. He looked at the confident, triumphant faces of his wife's family. He looked at Isabel, the woman for whom he had sacrificed a part of his own body, who was now asking him to sacrifice his dignity as well. A strange calm settled over him. The quiet before the storm. He knew what was in the cream-colored envelope she would slide across the table in a few moments. He knew the lines she had rehearsed. He knew everything they were about to do. And he knew, with chilling certainty, what he was about to do to them. He let the silence stretch, savoring the last few seconds of their blissful, arrogant ignorance. The curtain was about to rise on the final act. The moment, when it came, was exactly as they had rehearsed it. The clatter of dessert forks ceased. The last dregs of wine were swirled in crystal glasses. An expectant hush fell over the room, the same hush Elias remembered from the opening of this memory. Isabel took a steadying breath, her actress's poise firmly in place. She picked up the cream-colored envelope, his official death warrant in the land of the thorns, and pushed it across the vast, polished expanse of the mahogany table. The envelope slid with a soft, sibilant whisper, coming to a stop just inches from his hand. "Elias," she said, her voice a carefully modulated blend of sorrow and resolve, "I'm so sorry it has come to this. I will always be grateful for what you did for me. But we're just not on the same page anymore. I've filed for divorce. I think this is for the best." Julian smirked into his wineglass. Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, the picture of a man whose will had just been made manifest. They waited for the reaction they expected. Shock, pleading, perhaps a flash of anger that they could quickly quash. They waited for him to break. Elias did not break. He did not even look at the envelope. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, placed his napkin on the table. He looked up, and his gaze was not that of a victim. It was clear, steady, and unnervingly calm. He let his eyes travel from Marcus's smug face to Julian's sneering one, and finally, to Isabel's carefully constructed mask of regret. "This is quite a performance," he said, his voice quiet. yet it carried across the table with more weight than all of Marcus's booming pronouncements. "All of you. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this." Marcus stiffened. "This isn't a performance, Elias. This is reality. It's time you accepted it." "Oh, I accept it," Elias said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "But I think we have different definitions of reality." He gestured to the other envelope, the thick one Marcus had offered him. "Your severance package, Marcus. Tell me, how did you arrive at the figure?" Marcus was taken aback by the question. "It's a generous sum. More than you deserve." "And the stipend?" Elias continued, his voice still unnervingly placid. "The $1,000 a week you had Julian deliver. I have all the checks, by the way. Uncashed. A tidy little pile of them. You considered that a fair price for my troubles, did you?" "It was a gesture of goodwill," Julian snapped, his composure starting to fray. "Something you clearly don't understand." "No. I think I understand it perfectly," Elias said. "It was an assertion of power, a way to remind me of my place." He finally turned his full attention to Isabel. Her composure was beginning to crack, her rehearsed sorrow giving way to genuine unease. "And you, Isabel," he said softly, but the softness had a steel core. "The heart transplant. It was a miracle, wasn't it? The doctors said it was funded by a mysterious anonymous benefactor. A true godsend, I believe your father called it." Isabel nodded uncertainly. "Yes, we were so lucky." Elias leaned forward slightly, the first hint of intensity entering his demeanor. "Who did you think it was? Did you ever once stop to ask? Did you ever wonder who would spend over $2 million on surgeons, transportation, and post-operative care, and then simply vanish without a word?" A flicker of confusion crossed their faces. "Some philanthropist, obviously," Marcus said dismissively. "It doesn't matter who it was. The point is—" "The point," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through Marcus's bluster like a scalpel, "is that there was no anonymous benefactor. There was no philanthropist." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, then unbearable. He looked directly at Isabel, his eyes boring into hers. "I paid for it, Isabel." The statement landed in the center of the table like a grenade. Simple. Devastating. "What?" Isabel whispered, her face draining of color. "That's absurd," Marcus scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You don't have that kind of money. You're a small-time architect." "Am I?" Elias asked, a genuine question. He reached into the inner pocket of his simple, dependable navy suit. He did not pull out a weapon. He did not pull out a competing legal document. He pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. He opened it. "This is the reality, Marcus," Elias said, his voice now cold and hard as winter stone. "The reality is that your company, Thorn Corporation, was 3 weeks from insolvency 7 years ago. You over-leveraged on the South American expansion and your creditors were about to call in their debts. You were going to be ruined." He looked up from the journal. "You didn't tell your family, did you? You were too proud." Marcus's face was ashen. "How? How could you possibly know that?" "Because," Elias said, turning a page in his journal, "I was the one who bought your debt. Through a private equity firm I founded in my 20s, a firm called Ethelred Holdings." He let the name settle in the room. It was a name whispered in the highest financial circles, a ghost entity known for its ruthless efficiency and utter secrecy. "Ethelred," he continued, "bought your debt, restructured it, and then, as a gesture of, let's call it goodwill, We acquired a controlling interest in Thorn Corporation to stabilize it. You thought you were signing a deal with a Swiss investment group. You were signing a deal with me. You, Marcus, haven't been the majority shareholder of your own company for 7 years. You've been an employee. My employee. The silence that followed was no longer a weapon of their making. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from their lungs. Julian stared, his mouth agape. Isabel was trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, horrifying understanding. Elias was not finished. He turned to Julian. That sports car you love so much? The one you use to impress aspiring models? It's leased. The leasing company is a subsidiary of Ethelred. Consider your lease terminated. He turned back to Marcus. This house, this grand mansion, the seat of the Thorn dynasty, it was part of the corporate asset transfer to secure the initial loan. You don't own it. Ethelred Holdings owns it. I own it. You have been living here, in my house, for 5 years, treating me like an intruder. Finally, he looked at Isabel, his wife, the woman with his kidney and a heart he had bought for her. His voice softened, but it was the softness of immense, soul-deep disappointment. I fell in love with you, Isabel. I thought you fell in love with me. Elias Vance, the architect, the man, not the bank account. I hid it all because I wanted to be sure. I wanted a life built on something real, something that wasn't about money or status. He slowly stood up, pushing his chair back. He looked down at the cream-colored envelope from her, the divorce filing. He picked it up, but he didn't open it. He then picked up the thick severance envelope from Marcus. He held one in each hand. You have spent the last 2 months making it abundantly clear what you value, he said, his voice resonating with the quiet authority he had hidden for so long. You value status. You value appearances. You value wealth. He let the 2 envelopes drop from his hands. They fluttered to the plush Aubusson carpet. Forgotten. So, let me be clear about the new reality, he said, his gaze sweeping over their shattered, terrified faces. The divorce is proceeding. It will be uncontested as you wished. But you will get nothing, not a single cent, because you have nothing to take. The fortune you thought was yours is mine. The power you thought you wielded was mine. He walked towards the door of the dining room. He paused, his hand on the ornate handle. You wanted a new beginning. Free from the burdens of the past, he said, echoing Marcus's toast. You have it. You are free. You are free of the company, free of the house, free of the money. You are free of everything you thought made you who you are. He opened the door. Standing in the grand foyer were 2 figures. The impeccably dressed Evelyn Albright, holding a sleek leather portfolio, and the formidable Mr. Chen, his face a mask of calm impassivity. Elias turned back to the 3 frozen figures at the table. Miss Albright is here to oversee the transition. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Please leave the keys with her on your way out. With that, he stepped out of the dining room and closed the doors, leaving the Thorn family to drown in the deafening silence of their own ruin. The immediate aftermath was not the explosion of rage Elias might have expected. It was the implosion of a dying star. For a long, stunned moment, the 3 Thorns remained frozen in their tableau of shock around the dinner table. The world had not just shifted on its axis. It had been flipped upside down, shaken, and shattered. Marcus was the first to break. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure animalistic disbelief. He lunged for his phone, his fingers fumbling, fat and clumsy. I'm calling Henderson, he snarled, referring to his longtime corporate lawyer. This is a fantasy, a trick, corporate espionage. Julian, white-faced and trembling, looked at his father. A trick? Dad, did you hear him? He knew about the South American deal. Nobody knew about that. The bravado was gone, replaced by the terrified bleating of a lamb that has just understood the purpose of the abattoir. Isabel simply wept. Not the delicate, rehearsed tears of their plan, but ugly, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She stared at the closed dining room doors as if she could will Elias to walk back through them, to tell her it was all a monstrous joke. Why? She whispered to the empty air. Why would he do this? The doors opened again, but it was not Elias. It was Evelyn Albright, her presence radiating a chilling, absolute authority. She stepped into the room, followed by Mr. Chen. She placed her leather portfolio on the table with a soft, definitive thud. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice as crisp as a freshly printed stock certificate. "Your lawyer, Mr. Henderson, has already been contacted. By us. He was, shall we say, cooperative upon reviewing the preliminary documentation. He will advise you to do exactly as Mr. Vance has instructed." She opened the portfolio and spread a series of documents on the table. They were covered in signatures, seals, and clauses written in dense, impenetrable legalese. But the names were clear. Ethelred Holdings, Thorne Corporation, and, on the final damning page, the signature of the sole proprietor of Ethelred Holdings, Elias Vance. "This is the deed to this property," she said, tapping one document. "This is the controlling share certificate for the company. And this," she pushed a final paper towards Marcus, "is the signed personal guarantee you provided against the initial loan, pledging all personal and trust assets as collateral. Ethelred Holdings now holds that guarantee. You have no assets, Mr. Thorne. You have only debt, which Mr. Vance has graciously chosen not to call in, provided you cooperate fully." Marcus stared at the papers, his face a mottled canvas of purple and gray. He looked like he was going to have a stroke. "My company, my father's company," was about to be a footnote in financial history textbooks, Mr. Chen interjected, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it carried the immense weight of a man who moved markets with a single word. "Mr. Vance saved it. He gave you 7 years of a life you had already lost. You should be grateful." Julian, finally finding a spark of his old arrogance, stood up. "You can't do this. We'll fight you. We'll take this to the press." Evelyn Albright raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You'll go to the press with what, exactly, Mr. Thorne? That your father gambled away his legacy and was secretly bailed out? That your entire life has been a lie, funded by the man you openly mocked and humiliated? That you are, in fact, penniless? Please, do. I can have a press release drafted in 20 minutes. The headline would be sensational." Julian collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. The fight went out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. Isabel looked up at Evelyn, her face streaked with tears. "Where is he? I need to talk to him." "Mr. Vance has left," Evelyn said coolly. "He has business to attend to." She looked around the opulent room, her gaze clinical. "As I said, you have 24 hours. A moving service, also provided by Mr. Vance, will be here at noon tomorrow to pack your personal belongings and transport them to a storage facility. You will be given the key. After that, you will be trespassing." She turned to leave, her job done. At the door, she paused and looked back at Isabel. For the first time, a flicker of something other than professional detachment entered her eyes. It might have been pity. "He truly loved you, you know," she said quietly. "He gave you his kidney. He saved your life with a fortune he kept hidden so you would love the man, not the money. He gave you every chance to prove you were worthy of that love, and you gave him divorce papers at a celebratory dinner." She shook her head. a small, sad gesture. Some things can't be fixed. The doors closed, leaving them once again in silence. But this was a new silence. It was the silence of the void, the silence of absolute zero. It was the sound of a world ending. Marcus Thorne, the titan of industry, slumped in his chair, a broken old man. Julian, the smug prince, buried his face in his hands, and Isabel, the cherished princess, was left with the horrifying, indisputable truth. She had traded a king for a title, and in doing so had lost her entire kingdom. The heart in her chest, the heart Elias had bought for her, suddenly felt like a lead weight, a permanent beating reminder of the monumental scale of her betrayal. The days and weeks that followed the dinner were a brutal, systematic dismantling of a dynasty. The fall of the House of Thorne was not a loud, spectacular explosion witnessed by the entire city. It was a quiet, efficient, and utterly complete erasure. Elias had orchestrated it not with the fury of a vengeator, but with the detached precision of an architect demolishing a condemned building to make way for a new structure. The first consequence was the most visceral, the loss of the house. At noon the next day, as promised, a discreet moving crew arrived. Marcus, in a final pathetic act of defiance, had tried to refuse them entry. But the security guards, who had been on his payroll for a decade, now answered to Ethelred Holdings. They politely but firmly stepped aside, and the movers, clad in neat, featureless uniforms, began their work. They were not packing, they were excavating. They moved through the mansion with quiet purpose, wrapping chandeliers, crating artwork, and boxing up the trappings of a life that no longer existed. The Thornes were relegated to packing their personal effects into cardboard boxes, a task so beneath them they had never once in their lives performed it. Julian, clumsy and resentful, dropped a box of his father's cigars. Marcus, his face a thunderous mask, simply stared out the window, watching his world being bubble-wrapped and carried away. Isabel moved like a phantom, her hands touching the familiar objects, a silver-framed photo, a cashmere throw, as if they were artifacts from a lost civilization. By nightfall, they were standing on the curb, the grand facade of the mansion lit up behind them, a monument to their own folly. A single taxi, which Julian had to pay for with the last of the cash in his wallet, arrived to take them away. Their destination was not a suite at a five-star hotel, but a cramped two-bedroom apartment Julian had managed to secure on a short-term lease using a friend's credit card. The air in the taxi was thick with the poison of unspoken recriminations. The financial consequences followed with breathtaking speed. The Thorne credit cards were declined. The accounts at their exclusive clubs were suspended. The invitations to galas and charity balls stopped arriving. The phones, which had once rung off the hook with calls from business partners and society friends, fell silent. In the world of the ultra-rich, irrelevance is a communicable disease, and the Thornes had been diagnosed as terminal. Marcus tried to fight. He spent his days on the phone, calling old contacts, trying to leverage relationships built over a lifetime of power. But the doors were closed. The calls went unreturned. He learned the hard way that the loyalty he had commanded was not to him, the man, but to his position, a position that no longer existed. He was reduced to a bitter, impotent old man, pacing the small apartment and railing against the injustice of it all, blind to the fact that the justice was poetic and precise. Julian, stripped of his father's name and money, was utterly lost. He tried to get a job, but his resume was a collection of vanity titles at his father's company. He had no skills, no experience, and an attitude of entitlement that was toxic in any real-world environment. He was laughed out of interviews. His flashy suits and confident swagger now seemed pathetic, the desperate posturing of a man who refused to accept he was a nobody. For Isabel, the consequences were the most profound. She was adrift, stripped of not only her wealth but her very identity. She had been Isabel Thorne, the heiress, the socialite, the princess. Who was she now? She tried to contact Elias, but her calls went to a disconnected number. Her emails bounced back, blocked. He had excised her from his life as cleanly as a surgeon removing a tumor. Finally, in desperation, she went to his old office, the small architectural firm he had maintained as his cover. The name on the door was different. A young, eager architect was inside, working on a community housing project. He told her that Mr. Vance had sold him the firm for a symbolic $1, his only condition being that the firm take on at least 2 pro bono projects a year. Defeated, Isabel was left with only one choice. Elias, through his lawyer, had made her a final non-negotiable offer. It was not a settlement. It was a lifeline. A modest sum, enough to rent a small apartment and live for a year while she figured out what to do with her life. There were no strings attached, except one. She had to sign a document acknowledging that she was accepting it as a gift, not as a right, and that she would make no further claims on him, financial or otherwise, for the rest of her life. For a week, her pride warred with her desperation, but in the end, with rent due and her father and brother's constant toxic bickering filling the small apartment, she signed the papers. It was the most humbling moment of her life. As she signed her name, she realized the truth in Evelyn Albright's parting words. Elias hadn't just taken their money. He had held up a mirror, forcing them to see themselves for what they truly were: hollow, grasping, and, without the scaffolding of their wealth, utterly insignificant. The punishment wasn't poverty. It was clarity. 6 months passed. The seasons changed, and the city, in its indifferent way, moved on. The story of the Thorns' silent collapse was a brief, whispered gossip item among the elite before being replaced by the next scandal, the next spectacular fall from grace. For the world, they had simply vanished. Elias Vance, however, had not vanished. He had re-emerged, but not in the way anyone might have expected. He did not appear on the covers of financial magazines or give interviews about his secret empire, Athelred Holdings. He did not buy a fleet of supercars or a private island. The name Elias Vance remained, to the public, that of a competent but unremarkable architect. Ethelred Holdings continued to operate from the shadows, managed by the ever-efficient Mr. Chen, its profits now funneled into a charitable foundation so vast it could reshape nations. Elias himself was found not in boardrooms, but on construction sites. He had taken on a new project, one he designed and funded himself. It was not a gleaming skyscraper or a luxury condominium. It was a state-of-the-art medical facility in a low-income neighborhood, specializing in organ transplants for those who couldn't afford them. It was to be named the Lilly Foundation, after his mother. He was there one crisp autumn afternoon, reviewing blueprints with the site foreman when he saw her. Isabel. She was standing across the street, a ghost from another life. She was different. Her hair was simpler, her clothes were ordinary, jeans and a sensible coat. The designer armor was gone. She was thinner, and there were faint lines of worry around her eyes, but she also looked solid. The fragility was gone, replaced by a quiet self-possession. He watched as she hesitated, then walked into a small coffee shop on the corner. She went behind the counter, tied on an apron, and began wiping it down, preparing for the afternoon rush. She was working. A real job, with a uniform and a paycheck that likely barely covered her rent. Elias felt a complex mix of emotions: a pang of the old hurt, a flicker of pity, and a surprising grudging respect. She had taken the lifeline he had thrown her and was trying to swim on her own. She hadn't sunk into bitterness or despair. She was rebuilding. He turned back to his blueprints, the ache in his side a faint, familiar thrum. The wound was no longer raw. The anger had cooled into a scar, a permanent part of his history, but no longer a source of active pain. He had won, but he found no joy in the victory. The true reward was not in their downfall, but in his own survival, his own integrity intact. A few days later, a letter arrived at the construction site's temporary office. It was addressed to him in a familiar, elegant handwriting. He opened it with a strange sense of trepidation. "Elias," it began, "I don't expect you to read this, and I certainly don't expect a reply. I have no right to ask anything of you, ever again. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, because what I did is unforgivable. I'm not writing to make excuses, because there are none. I'm writing to say thank you, not for the money you gave me to start over, but for the kidney, and for the heart you paid for. They are gifts I did not deserve, and they are the only things of true value I have left. The heart beats, the kidney functions. They are constant physical reminders of my own profound failure, but also of your profound decency. I see the facility you're building. It's beautiful. It's something good in the world, something real. I'm glad you're using your power for that. You were always the better person. I was just too blind and too weak to see it. I hope, one day, you find a happiness that is as deep and as true as your character. Isabel." He folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anger. He felt a quiet, profound sadness for the man and woman they could have been. He looked at the rising structure of the clinic, its steel skeleton reaching for the sky. It was a building made of concrete and glass, but it was also built on a foundation of pain, loss, and a hard-won wisdom. He had lost a wife, but he had found himself. He had learned that you can't force someone to value what is real. You can only build something real yourself, and hope it stands the test of time. The Lily Foundation opened on a bright, windswept day in spring, a year after the dinner that had changed everything. It was a marvel of architecture and compassion, a building that was as beautiful as it was functional. Sunlight streamed through vast windows into patient rooms designed to feel like sanctuaries, not cells. The operating theaters were equipped with technology that was years ahead of its time. In the lobby, a simple, unadorned plaque read, "For all who need a second chance." Elias stood at the back of the crowd during the dedication ceremony, avoiding the podium and the politicians who had come to claim a piece of the reflected glory. He was not the public face of this venture. That role was filled by a respected doctor, the new head of the clinic. Elias was content to be the architect, the silent force behind the dream. He watched as the first family, a young mother and her son who would be receiving a life-saving transplant, cut the ribbon. The boy's hopeful, terrified face was a mirror of what Isabel's must have been. This time, however, the gift would be received with the pure, unadulterated gratitude it deserved. He had found his purpose. It wasn't in punishing the thorns, but in rectifying the imbalance they represented. Where they had hoarded wealth for status, he would redistribute it for health. Where they had prized appearance over substance, he would build things that were substantial, things that lasted, things that healed. The fate of the thorns was a quiet postscript to his new life. Marcus, broken by the loss of his empire and his pride, had suffered a real stroke a few months after their eviction. He was now living in a state-run nursing facility, his mind and body failing, a ghost haunting the corridors of his own past mistakes. Julian had drifted into a life of petty schemes and borrowed money, a perennial disappointment who blamed the world for his own inadequacies. They were not tragic figures. They were simply the inevitable product of their own choices. Their lives a testament to the fact that a foundation of arrogance will always eventually crumble. And Isabel? He never saw her again after that day at the coffee shop. He heard through a circuitous route that she had left the city. She had moved to a small town in the Midwest, taken a course to become a paralegal, and was living a quiet, anonymous life. She had not remarried. She had not tried to contact him again. She was, in her own way, serving a penance of normalcy, a life sentence of quiet dignity she had to earn every single day. Perhaps, in that quiet life, she had found a semblance of the peace that had so long eluded her. Elias walked through the halls of his new clinic, the scent of fresh paint and possibility in the air. He thought of the letter from Isabel, the last communication between them. He had kept it. It was a reminder not of her betrayal, but of the immense, transformative power of truth. Their story was a painful one, a brutal lesson in love, loss, and the true measure of a person's worth. True wealth is not held in a bank. It is held in the heart. True power is not the ability to command others, but the strength to control oneself. And true justice is not about revenge, but about the restoration of balance. Elias Vance had given his wife his heart, and she had filed for divorce. In the end, he had lost a wife and a fortune he never wanted, but he had gained a world he could shape for the better. He was no longer just an architect of buildings. He was an architect of hope. And in the quiet, steady work of building, he had finally, truly, come home. What do you believe is the ultimate measure of a person's character? Is it the grace with which they handle success, or the dignity with which they endure betrayal? Could Elias have ever found it in himself to forgive Isabel? Or are some actions so damaging that they sever all possibility of redemption? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of quiet strength and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales of integrity, justice, and the enduring power of the human spirit.